Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andy. Thanks for having me back. I was saying it feels like old home week. We were here in early June with 80-ish people from around the country, which make up the Small Scale Forum, and it was really amazing. And it was somewhat serendipitous. My wife and I were on our way to Santa Barbara for Thanksgiving. We stopped over here for night, and I thought, boy, what a perfect town to bring the Small Scale Forum. So it happened all very quickly. We had a lot of people in the room here involved, and it was, I think, one of the best forums that we've had. So kudos to everybody that's been involved in shaping and evolving this community. Real quickly, I want to know who my audience is. How many people do we have in here that are architects? Quite a few. How many are builders, developers? How many are just interested citizens? Oh, wow, good, great. City, policy, nonprofit. Okay, good. Okay, here's the really key question. Anybody here from the capital markets? No finance. Okay, we got to all work together to get the finance people in these rooms, because that's the last, I'll talk a little bit about it, but that's clearly the last, I think, barrier to this kind of stuff that we all want to see. So as Jim said, I'm a landscape architect. I spent a lot of my years doing traditional landscape architecture, urban design, large-scale planning, and I jokingly say I went back to school 15 years into my career because most of the stuff I drew never got built. And it was like, what don't I understand about our clients? What is it I don't understand? I can't communicate with the real challenges of getting things built that we want to see in the world. And that was a really seminal moment for me, because it was like learning a foreign language. And I think a lot of us that aspire to great design and great places don't understand some of the complexities that we're forced to work against as designers and aspirational developers. And so learning that was super helpful, and it has really guided a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'd like to talk about, I call this my small beginnings. And as I said, I was trained as a landscape architect, and a lot of my work in my early career were really big projects, big infill in downtown San Francisco, the Brannan, big planned communities. This is Summerlin in Las Vegas, one of the first projects I was involved in. Actually walked out on the site when it was owned by Howard Hughes, and there was nothing out there. 25,000 acres in the Las Vegas desert. And I said, well, we'll never see this in my lifetime. And in about 10 years, it was completely built out. But while I would work on these projects, and we'd do these project teams and charrettes, which was all very exciting, especially as a young designer, I'd find myself, this was the kind of stuff, this was the kind of projects that represented what the industry was holding up as the gold standard, where the capital markets were going, largely where a lot of the design schools were teaching. It was all about big master planned projects that were coming from institutional and corporate developers. And so while I would be working for those people and learning their language and trying to cajole them, I would find myself hanging out in places like this at night. And this is a small project, if anybody knows Kevin Cavanaugh from Guerrilla Development in Portland, Oregon. This is a project that Kevin did. And Kevin has a great phrase, which is, he always says, in real estate, we talk about highest and best use. And he says, but highest and best use for whom? So this is a half-acre site in an emerging neighborhood that he could have probably built 150 units on. And, but instead he decided to turn this into 4 incubator kitchens, so that people that lived in the neighborhood where English was not their first language had an opportunity to start their career, build their business as restaurants, provide a third place for the neighborhood. And for him as a developer, it was a much lower risk proposition because there's relatively low capital. And as he says, if one of them didn't make it, and some of them didn't, he could turn it over in 48 hours and have somebody else in there operating. Now imagine if he built a 40,000 square foot cheesecake factory during COVID. What do you do with that? So the resilience and the flexibility of small scale development, and ultimately, so what is the highest and best use for this site? The other thing about this project is this was a half-acre auto repair shop in this kind of disinvested neighborhood. And so I kind of came to the conclusion there's a lot more places like this than there are 25,000 acres in the Las Vegas desert, and kind of where I thought I wanted to spend my time. So I had this thesis that while a lot of the world, a lot of the magazine covers, a lot of the award programs, a lot of the design schools were focusing in the upper left-hand quadrant, there was something interesting happening here in the lower right-hand quadrant between bootstrap capital, entrepreneurial cultures, people working at a small, contextual, incremental place. So that led to the formation of the Small Scale Developer Forum that Jim mentioned and what we brought here. And so I'm about to do the 24th one next in 2 weeks in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The 23rd one was here. And the thesis was, is there somebody else that feels the same way as I do, that there's these interesting nooks and crannies of places that could benefit from stewardship and care that's building neighborhoods, not just projects? And so we would go around the country and we would see these things, and we'd hear the stories, we'd hear the challenges, we'd see the impact and the benefits that these people were bringing to their communities. And so that led to the book. I thought this is a story that's too important to not to be told, because again, most of the books were either your father's real estate book and way too dense for the average person who is an entrepreneur, or they weren't telling the power of really good built environment changing the human condition. And so wrote the book, very much a passion project, the best thing to come out of COVID. I also say if I had finished it on time, it would have been a very different book. I was 2 years late. But during those extra 2 years, I was doing 2 of my own projects, and I learned, not just academically, but firsthand, the real challenges that go into being a small-scale developer, and what is different about it than what they might teach you at an MRED school or a CCIM class or whatever. They're very different kind of nuanced approaches. And the book was written with a couple of real intentionalities. The first was, it's a what and why. It's a little bit of the journalistic, like, what is small scale development? And I'll talk about that, but why it's important and why it matters probably more now than 20 years ago. Changes in demographics, search for authenticity, people concerned about their communities. The second thing was, how do you do it? So it's a toolkit that was meant for real estate entrepreneurs that, again, wanted to focus their career on that. And then the last is the classic kind of case studies, but not just projects that were small scale, how they were put together, the numbers, but also the people that were doing it. So you understood their mission and what motivated them to do that. The nonprofits that were using this as a vehicle to heal and reassemble neighborhoods. And even agencies that were leading the way to clearing the barriers through regulations that were making it hard for small developers to do this stuff. The other thing, it was written for 2 audiences, and the first was obvious, the real estate entrepreneur that wanted to do this, but the second one was for electeds, city staff, and even what I call citizen activists. So as I go around the country, and I was doing a lot of consulting around this work, a lot of the people in the room that were, interested in this, we've got people here like that, interested in this, and they say, yeah, that's what we want. We want more of that small scale, fine-grained, locally owned businesses. And my response is, do you know how hard you have made it? So if that's what you really want, then we've really got to think differently about our regulations, about our approval processes, and more than anything, being willing to experiment, being willing to try some new things and see what happens, rather than always looking and making the perfect the enemy of the good. So the first question I always get asked, because real estate is a very quantitative industry, is, well, Jim, what do you mean by small? And I say, it's not, how many square feet? What's the dollar threshold from a big project to a small project? And I say, it's a qualitative definition, not a quantitative definition. This was small. This is how we used to build places. Guy would buy a lot, they'd buy 2 lots next to it, they'd build 3 townhomes, the family would live in one, they would rent it to the employees or friends of theirs, that they could live there affordably. Somebody would do it down the street, they'd do the same thing. Over time, the block would fill in. You'd have this incremental organic evolution of the blockscape. So the block, the street, became the neighborhoods that we love the most. Small was missing middle before it was cool. This is from one of our tours, programs that we did in Savannah. These are called the train houses. These are like 900 square foot cottages right across from the really lovely big mansions that you always see in Savannah, where the people that work there actually could live across the street. It's a duplex, but the key here is that dignified approach to the street. Small is a gateway to those that are interested in the built environment to learning the process of building. This was my very first project in Healdsburg, a 980 square foot workman's cottage that I renovated and became kind of the launch pad for a lot of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. But the thing One of the key things that came out of this, aside from learning what single wall construction is, for those of you that know what that means, and the process of getting permits and dealing with contractors and all of that, was how many people, this was on the historic home tours and a lot of city tours and things like that, how many people would come through and say, I had no idea that small scale could actually feel so good, and it's not about square footage, it's about the quality of design. So it kind of, and they would say, why don't people build stuff like this anymore? And I'd say, well, because there's no economic value in it, the way things get appraised. The other thing that's happening, and it's really exciting about the small scale movement, it is creating what we call citizen developers. People who own parcels, people who have the skill set and the mindset to be able to build and develop, and so they want to create projects that they can own, build wealth, but also be part of the housing solution. This is one of the members of our small scale forum, Carrie Westerbeck, an architect in Bothell, Washington. Really lovely little 3-unit above a commercial building, won a bunch of awards, but he and his family live in one of them, rent the other 2 out, rent the commercial out, that helps service the mortgage. I mean, very practical in some ways, but very important, holding the corner of an important block there in Bothell. So sometimes it's easier when people say, well, what do you mean by small? It's easier to talk about what it is not before I talk about what it is. And so first of all, it is not a product. When the book came out, a lot of people said, oh, your book's out. Is it about tiny houses? I love tiny houses. And I say, well, tiny houses are in here. But no, it is not about tiny houses. It's about something more than that. It's not about dollar and size value, as I said. The other thing is it's not where you wait to scale. I think there's some people in the industry that are kind of cynical. It's like, well, when you want a real job, give us a call and we'll bring you into our corporate executive thing, where you're doing that small stuff. This is what we have within our group, we have this thing called small on purpose. People who have been doing this for 20 or 30 years because they believe in the power of building neighborhoods incrementally and organically. The worst part about small is it is not easier than big. So many of our processes have been set up for the fear of the bigger projects that the small guys get run through that gauntlet. So the approval process, the fees, the punitive kind of exactions that get added to a big project also gets added to a small project. So when I talk in state legislation and things like that, I talk about a small bypass, that if this is what we really want, we need to recognize that projects of a certain size need to be accelerated and not have the same burden as some of the other projects that can afford to cover those costs. So what is small? First of all, it is a method, not a product. It's a method for building enduring places. It's a broader view of return. If you look at any of the people who are part of our group and you look at their websites and you look at their philosophy, they're disciplined about the capital and the ability and the need to create wealth, but they're also equally balanced with social responsibility, job creation, environmental responsibility. So it is a balanced look at their impact on the built environment. Another important part is its long-term hold and value creation. It's not like I'll get in, I'll build it, I'll stabilize it, and then I'll flip it to somebody at a, name that 3x, 2x, whatever else. This is about, I'm going to make that initial increment of investment, and it may be break even, but I'm going to be able to create value in the buildings around that, and then I'll be able to build that up and over time. So it's a very much a long-term view of what you're doing and the importance of it. That also means it's hyper-local. You don't figure this out and then go to 15 cities. You kind of double down, not just in a city, but in the neighborhood where you're in, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the last thing is it's about building projects and building neighborhoods. We talk about small-scale developers in site investment. We want the work that we do to create others and encourage others to come and invest in the places that we're working. So it's kind of unlocking the potential. And Sue Mosey, who runs a project called Midtown Detroit, it's a nonprofit, and one of Sue's the magic things that Sue did, if anybody's, who's been to Detroit since kind of the rebirth? All right, a couple of you. I mean, amazing. You put it on your bucket list. Got to go see it. I know it sounds weird, but you really got to see it. Amazing place in Midtown. Incredible buildings. It'll make you cry because they're like $10,000. I mean, you can't even buy, you can't even get a permit, in California for that price. There you can get a beautiful 3-story brick building. But Susie's story was, she formed this nonprofit. She would go into these neighborhoods and the developers would say, well, that doesn't work. There's no market. I can't get the funding. So through just bootstrap capital and moxie and chutzpah, she got stuff built, and they're like, wow, there is a market here. She kind of proved the market on the back of a nonprofit. by building projects that then built the neighborhood. So a lot of people might say, again, the more cynical people say, well, that's kind of cute and quaint, but we've got some real problems, and like how small part of the solution? And this is part of a housing presentation I did in San Francisco, but this is an interesting little factoid that 2022, 19% of all housing units produced in California was an ADU. So think about that. 1 in 5 housing units was an ADU, which is, you don't get much smaller than an ADU, maybe a tiny house, but you don't get much smaller than an ADU. So it's pretty incredible that this kind of, instead of seeking those bigger, we need to get a 400 unit project in on this vacant parking lot, why don't we get 200 units dispersed throughout the community, filling in the nooks and crannies of the broken teeth of the neighborhoods? And how do we do that as opposed to a bunch of incentives just going to big projects that sometimes don't fit into the character of the neighborhood? Okay, so I've defined small. So now why should you care? I mean, you're already here because you probably believe in this stuff, but this is the pitch that I give to people maybe that are a little less, haven't quite drunk the Kool-Aid yet. So why do you care? And I'll tell you there's four key reasons that through the tours, through the book, I think why small really matters and why it matters now. So the first one is this kind of wonkish planning term. We've got some people from the Cal Poly here, they'll get this, grain, and it's really about the fabric and character and connectivity of communities. And I think this is probably one of the most important contributions that small-scale development makes to communities. It's one of the things that I focus a lot in terms of my development and design and advisory work for people, and I think it really is what makes places very unique. So this is, I'll show you this. So first of all, I always start with this slide, and it's kind of a little pop quiz. So where are we here? Who knows? Come on. What was it? No. I wish. Savannah, come on, everybody knows that. How about here? Irvine. Very good, very good. You read the book. I always love when people say anywhere USA, and they're probably right. So yes, Savannah and Irvine. So this is from a very famous book called Great Streets by Alan Jacobs. He went around the world and he mapped in figure ground form cities all over the world in 1 mile square. So these are equal squares of cities and captures. And why this is important is to look at the images below. So this is what you would definitely consider a fine-grained city. And you can imagine when you squint that a building could cut down and a building could infill and this empty lot could get filled in. And over time, you'd have that evolutionary, organic, very humane kind of space getting created. What do you do with that? How do you ever humanize that without raising it and starting again? And so as public planners and people in the public sector and even developers thinking about the grain that you lay out from the beginning and how you're going to make that work to allow small and big development to occur is probably one of the most critical decisions that you can make for setting up a place for the long term. Any followers of strong towns? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, I figured you'd have some in the audience here. I love this piece. Andrew Price wrote this piece on fine-grained versus coarse-grained urbanism. And he talked about the value of a fine-grained neighborhood. And some of it's pretty obvious. You get a diversity of ownership because you have smaller lots. You get a lower cost of entry for people to be because you have smaller lots. You have more destinations, which, ironically in LEED ND's rating system is one of the values that leads to, a higher quality place, just having more interesting things to see along the street. It's also part of Charles Montgomery's kind of philosophy in Happy Cities. But the thing that I loved most about this was fine grain gives you greater resistance to bad buildings. And think of how many places you've been where an entire block has had a 1970s really bad building parachuted in and it's stuck there for generations. Versus a block where you've got 2 great buildings and 3 not so great or 3 bad buildings, but you notice the good buildings. So that ability of a finer grain to absorb, they call it the blockscape resilience, the ability for it to absorb maybe less enlightened architecture, which we were practicing like in the 70s, is really a function of grain. So I love to tell this story, and this will mean a lot to you because A, this is the developer that did the Hotel San Luis Obispo, but it's also, I think, a place that you can relate to. So Healdsburg, where I live, and it's a great story about granularity and the importance of fine-grained, small-scale development and the benefits to not only the community, but to the developer. So how many people have been to Healdsburg? Pretty good cross section. Okay, so Healdsburg, the center of Healdsburg revolves around our perfect 1 acre downtown plaza. It's ranked number 2 in the country by the Smithsonian. The only one that's better than that is the one in Chautauqua, which is where my mom lived, so she always used to like give me a hard time about that. But anyway, so everything revolves around that. And for many years, this parcel right here was empty. It was an RDA, redevelopment property that the city owned, and in 1990s, a developer came in and said, I've got your back. I got a solution here. We're gonna build a Kmart there. And fortunately, our city leaders had the foresight to say, you know, it's been vacant for 10 years. It can sit a couple more years. We can wait. And so Merritt Sher, Charlie Palmer, the people, Paulo Patron came in and they did Hotel Healdsburg. Now, Hotel Healdsburg is 50 keys. And any conventional institutional developer would tell you 50 keys doesn't work. It's got to be bigger than that. It's not efficient. You can't make that work. But they went ahead and they did it anyways. And it was so successful that they went down the street and they did H2, which is about 37 keys on an old gas station lot. And that was so successful, they came in and they did Harmon Guest House, which was about 35 keys. So at the end of the day, they had kind of the magic of 120 keys, which the conventional markets would say, you know, you need to make it work if you're ever gonna have a conference. But they had the ability to brand each of those differently, hit a different price point, provide a different guest experience. And as I joke, when they're busy, they've got a very long service corps that just happens to be the sidewalk out in front. So if one restaurant's busy and the other one's not, they can move up and down the street. The city's benefited because the grain and character of that street front was maintained intact. And if you squint and look at that image and say, okay, what if somebody had brought in a 120 room, name that flag brand and just kind of plopped it in there, we would have had a very different nature to our downtown. So it's a great example of, I think, a little bit of leadership and patience from the city, and then a really enlightened developer. Ironically, the city had no design guidelines this time, and it's really, I have two big philosophies. First of all, good design guidelines in the hands of bad architects produces bad architecture, so you should just hire good architects. And secondly, that cities, in a lot of ways, just need to get out of the way and hire good architects and have somebody who can actually work with the developer on an urban design basis rather than trying to have them meet the code of what was intended, but we don't really know what we want and all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, hire good architects. And that's what Healdsburg has been blessed with. I think it's attracted, and probably much like this city, there's so much great in urbanism in the DNA. It attracts people who want to do good work, and so they bring that to the table, and fortunately the city's been fairly receptive to that. Oh, I kind of forgot to do all these. Okay, there we go. Okay. So grain is one of them. The second one is authenticity. And I think, you can just imagine a lot of these images I've shown you, those are places that feel much more authentic because they're not some formulaic design that came in from developer's portfolio that has done 10 of them around the country, and this is what we always do. We just change the colors and the materials based on the weather there. And a lot of the interesting things about small scale development, I use this image, this is from Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And this is kind of a dumb, simple image, but it really speaks to what is the magic of small, which is you can create a lot of place with very few dollars. And so Adirondack chairs, picnic tables, a little fire pit, pizza, beer, and a truck that has a little slide on it. And as a small developer, you can kind of get the mojo going. You can kind of figure out what the community wants. The community has a sense of authorship. It's like, oh, we love that place. And if you find out nobody ever sits in the Adirondack chairs, you can just add some more picnic tables and you haven't spent $50,000 in fixed investment. So you can learn and evolve the program. And that's when I talk to communities, and this idea about experimenting, let these things evolve and experiment so you can see what the market wants, as opposed to, we've gotten into a place where you have to predict every possible outcome in the regulatory documents, and by the time you finally get it approved, the market has completely shifted. So it's like, okay, so how can we try some stuff and see and help build to the market and have the market help us build that? This is another great example of both grain and, I think, authenticity, and I love this story. This is in Charleston, South Carolina, where my daughter went to college, so I got to know the city very well, and this is an 83-room Marriott Residence Inn. Now, you wouldn't think that from the outside, And there's a lot of cities, and Charleston, you may know, was the first city in the country to have historic preservation guidelines. So there's a lot of cities that have historic guidelines that would have said, okay, you're going to build a new hotel wing. You need to make it look like that historic building, you know, so it looks like that. But to the city's credit, they said, no, this is a different era. You know, do it well, do good materials, do good fenestration, do good proportions, but it's okay to be contemporary. And then the key of this is obviously the workhorse is in the back. But when we talk about grain and authenticity, when you walk down that street, you can see the rhythm and pattern of the blockscape has been maintained by those two front leading buildings, and then the building behind it is actually, so it's kind of met the economic need of a more traditional flag hotel while still responding to the character and scale and grace of that particular neighborhood and blockscape. Economy. One of the things that I think is really exciting about small-scale development is there is a direct relationship between the businesses that most people want, which are those cool, locally owned, independently developed, kind of entrepreneurial businesses, and small-scale developers, because the traditional real estate developers and or projects won't take them because they're not credit tenants. So there's this relationship that gets created very early on, and we find in a lot of the projects that our cohort is doing, they are actually in business, because the guy might be a really great coffee shop kind of thinker and designer and all that, but a lousy business person, so needs some capital. So there's a lot of synergy with the businesses putting sliver equity in the deal, so much more complicated than traditional real estate, which scares a lot of traditional real estate people off. But I think it's what makes these things more interesting and unique. The other thing that we found during 2008, it is those local businesses who stick around when things get tough. And imagine what we saw in 2008, it was the chains that kind of mailed the keys back typically, but it was the local people where your entire balance sheet is tied up in the business. You kind of truck in every day and open the doors and try to make it work because you're relying, you know, that is your entire net worth. And so there's a real value in those small locally owned businesses. One of the things that I was really impressed with here, and one of the reasons we came here, was it seems like, and I'm sure there's people will feel differently about it, from an outsider, it feels like you've really struck a Goldilocks balance between the so-called formula retail and the local retail. And we're struggling with that right now in Healdsburg. There's this huge, you know, hue and cry about, oh no, the chains are coming in, everybody wants it. But I think there's a balance that can be struck by both of those, and you need what both of them bring to the table. So I applaud what you've done here for being able to balance that out. So back to this issue of grain, there was a great report that the National Trust did back in 2014 through an organization. They had a thing called the Preservation Green Lab, which was looking at the green value of preservation or adaptive reuse of buildings. And they did this really cool study. So they looked at 3 cities in the country, Washington, D.C., Seattle, and San Francisco, and they mapped building size, parcel size, kind of street grain, age of building, tax dollars, jobs, and then they cross-referenced it to Yelp ratings and cell phone activity at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. And they came up with this thing that they called the Jane score. So everybody's heard of walk score, right? So this was the Jane score for Jane Jacobs. What is the character and fabric that makes places more interesting and dynamic? And so they published it, and one of the key things that came out of this was that they said was fine-grained development, old and new, so it wasn't just about old buildings. Fine-grained development is a key factor in the economic success of communities. So what they found were those neighborhoods that had the most diversity of building type, most diversity in building age, most diversity in building size, had more women and minority-owned businesses, more jobs per square foot, more tax dollars per square foot. And then they went on and did this to 50 other cities. It's called the Atlas of Cities. I think you can kind of look it up. But it's a pretty cool, and it was an interesting analysis to kind of try to connect economic development data to this issue of the built environment and granularity. So this is one of my favorite projects that we saw in Nashville, Tennessee. A young broker who wanted to be a small-scale developer. How many of these have you seen in the country, right? You know, so his specialty was leasing to food and beverage operators, and he did a lot of restaurant work. And so the shorthand in Nashville was, if you wanted to open a restaurant, it took 6 to 9 months to get it open, permit, and all that kind of stuff, and cost about $60,000 to open the doors. And much like Kevin and his deal in Portland, there were a lot of people who that English was not their first language. There's no way they were going to navigate the permit process. There was no way that they could kind of get through all this, and they just wanted to do their craft, which was like great food. So he converted the car wash into 6 kitchen incubators. Actually 5. The secret in any of these things is the developer keeps the bar, and then you rent out the rest of it. So he kept the bar. But anyways, so he's got 5 of these, and at the end of the day, the success of this was, and he operates the operating space, and it's an open now. We all went and had lunch there, and it was very cool. But the secret is a couple of things. People pay almost twice as much per square foot for their rent, but the absolute dollars is a number that they can understand. So when you're dealing with micro retail like this, it's not the dollars per square foot. It's like, oh, $1,500 a month. Oh, I know I can make that. This is my. So it's simplifying the math and not try. Oh, 2.25 versus 250. I don't know how we do that. Where it used to be for somebody to come in 6 to 9 months to get open at $60,000, they could be up and running in 2 days for $2,000. So he could get people, again, who this was not, all they wanted to do was cook great food. They could get in there and start operating away. So, and this was in a neighborhood, again, that was emerging, became a third place for the neighborhood. He was doing a real service to all of these people who had moved there from somewhere else in the world, as well as providing a really interesting place for the community. And this was the bar, this kind of great little mid-century, which became kind of a hangout for people that lived in there. And then the last one, I know this is a somewhat troubled word. I know I can use this here. I was in Texas last week. I was a little worried about what would happen when I put this slide up. But anyways, one of the interesting things without intention that has happened over the last couple of years is we're finding so many people who are interested in this path because they want to return to the neighborhoods they grew up in, and they want to be part of the solution. They don't want to go work for a corporate REIT. And so many of the programs out there are teaching people to be corporate real estate developers, not use real estate as a way to heal neighborhoods. And so they're there and they're coming in. This is a program in Philadelphia called Black Squirrel. It's a really interesting mashup. The city of Philadelphia has 6,500 vacant tax lots. They put it with a tech accelerator and a CDFI, and they take people of color who want to be builders and developers, and they give them each 5 lots for $1. 3 of the lots have to be affordable to 60% AMI, and the other 2 are market rate. So through a 2-year process, they're learning the process of development, they're building and filling in the broken teeth in the neighborhoods, and they're starting to be part of the affordable housing ownership solution. This is another project in northeast Oklahoma City, one of a pivot project, one of the long-standing members of our group. And they did an interesting, this is a neighborhood that had been redlined, had not seen any investment for 30 years. They finally cobbled together a series of grants and got a local regional bank to step in and actually provide most of the funding. And it's a kind of fairly banal strip center. I mean, how many of these you've seen around the country? They got a medical clinic to come in, first medical services in that neighborhood in probably 40 or 50 years. And then they created these single bays where they required it to be local entrepreneurs in the neighborhood that were the tenants. But not only did they make them the tenants, they gave them the opportunity to earn equity. So if your business, if you paid your rent for 10 years and you ran that business for 10 years, you actually earned a slice of the building. And so it wasn't just about making a business that was operating, you were actually benefiting by laddering up into the equity of the building. And you didn't even have to keep your business going. You just had to make sure that the rent was being paid and everything. And Jonathan Dodson, who's the CEO of this company, was telling a really funny story where they had Cricket Wireless came in and they wanted to take one of the bays. So everybody who is a tenant there is effectively a member of the LLC, kind of has a future, if you will, to the LLC. And so they had to talk about this, and they're like, no, we don't want Cricket. I mean, Cricket's like, that's like local. Why aren't we getting AT&T? Why don't we get Verizon? And he's like, I never thought so. It was really interesting that the people who were the tenants now were concerned about the other kind of tenants that were coming in and what that would do to the brand of the center because they owned a piece of it. So it's a very interesting psychology of what ownership translates to. So So I'm going to just do a quick survey of what I call what does small look like. Talked a little bit about the importance of why it, the 4 things that matter about it, what it is. So what does this actually translate to in projects? So I've shared a few from around the country, but I want to share some from that we've seen. So this is one of my favorite projects and a great example of the citizen developer, much like Carrie's project, a little 4-unit infill apartment building in a disinvested neighborhood, a kind of emerging neighborhood in Oklahoma City. Anybody been to Oklahoma City? Okay, cool. This is in the Plaza District, which was one of those kind of mid-century shopping center districts, a little bit coming up. They had some really cool programs. But anyway, so young architect bought an empty lot, and he just kind of backed into it and said, okay, what's the most loan I can get and have 3 of my friends pay rent that will support the mortgage that's affordable to them and cover the building, and then built and designed back from that. So very simple building. I love the juxtaposition within this kind of this kind of older fabric, but it fits in. And very simple interiors. He actually did a lot of the construction himself. So this is the idea, much like that first slide I showed when I said, this was small. Here's somebody who was building housing that his friends could live in affordably, and at the same time it was helping to pay his mortgage. Starland Yard, this is a great project. I mean, a little bit, you've seen some of these around the country, but an interesting story about both transition and creativity. So we're in Savannah. I showed that image. That was the historic quarter of Savannah. There's an area that's kind of the trolley stop, the outer first ring suburb of that called the Victorian District. And so a couple of developers bought this lot, again, a ½ acre, seems to be the magic size, that was in this up and coming neighborhood. And their thesis was, we'll do a covered land play, we'll activate it, we'll get a little bit of revenue from it, and when the time comes, we'll build 150 apartments on it. So they set out to do what seems to be, again, fairly ubiquitous. They did the shipping container thing. But one of the interesting quirks in Georgia is that if you do one of these food gatherings, 50% of your revenue on Sunday has to come, 51% has to come from food. So as I said earlier with the other deal, if you're the developer, you keep the bar, but you lease everything else. Now, if they just have the bar, then their revenue is not coming from any kind of food. So they came up with this creative hack, which is the shipping containers basically form a wall around the site. And you come in through this portal here. And when you come in, you swipe your credit card. And so now every purchase you make is already in the system. And even the food trucks they bring in there, they give them the point of sale system. And so if you go up to buy something, it's actually paying into their system. And why this is important is, number one, on a Sunday, they got, obviously got all of their food revenue that they needed. But what they found was 2 things. First of all, as a developer, now they're getting all the revenue. And the way it typically works with a food truck is the food truck pays 12 to 14% of their gross to the landlord as rent. But you had $1,000 in cash sales. Are you going to report that to the landlord, or was it more like $200? This way, all of that money is coming to the developer, and then they're writing a check back to the food truck. But because of the reduction in friction in terms of point of sale, the food trucks were doing 5 times the business here than they were out on a normal street. And just think about it. You're there with your friends. You're having a great time. You're like, hey, anybody want a beer? Yeah, you walk up, you get a beer. You're not waiting, oh, that card got declined, or that person can't get paid, or they don't have enough cash. Or it's just like super simple. And so it was a really brilliant kind of way that the regulations actually led them to a very effective business model. It was so successful that they've kind of scrapped the apartment thing and are actually building 3 permanent brick and mortar restaurants as a part of it. So it's really kind of great, and like some of the other projects I mentioned, became an epicenter for this neighborhood that was looking for kind of a heart and soul. Craftwork. So this is my project, one of my projects in Healdsburg. This was an old bank, as you can tell, built in 1963. This is what I inherited. This was a lease deal, and we turned it into this. And this was one of the things about small-scale development that we talk a lot about in our cohort is a lot of it is adaptive reuse. because we believe in the soul of buildings, and we want to retain that soul and character and tell that story again. So you think about, you know, this kind of sad space that had been forlorn and lost for a while, and then bringing it back. And people always come in and like, I can't imagine, like, you know, that this is, and the shopping center is pretty tired looking, but you come in the space, it's great. And the creativity that goes into being a small scale developer, this was the vault, and it was a horrible space, and it's like, what are you going to do with that? And we talked about, do we take it out? It was going to be $30,000 to remove it. But as you can see, it had this lime green epoxy paint inside, and it was very claustrophobic. So the other thing about small scale developers is we're very naive, and I just said, well, we'll just cut the back of the vault out. So that's what we did. We cut it out, sandblasted, and it now is our premium conference space. So people do wine dinners and they do tastings in there. So it's a little bit of a lemons to lemonade story. But the other thing about it is we really set this up. It's not just about the office function. It's about being the community living room. And so book clubs, women's networking groups, nonprofits, social events, all of those kinds of things, because we're located, and a big part of our ethos is not only to provide high quality workspace for people, but to also provide a place for the community to gather and have important conversations. Much like this, we've been trying, because we're one of those cities that, you know, there's quite a bit of consternation about growth and change and all that. And so we wanted to create a place where people could come together and have positive, constructive conversations about what an upbeat future could look like, as opposed to the sky is falling. Another one that I love is, and some of you may be familiar with this, what I call big meets small. And as I was putting this kind of thesis together and evolving it over this is not a binary decision. It's like, oh, all big is bad and small is lovely. There's a world for both. I think the small scale has been lost in the conversation as a solution set. And so part of the purpose behind the book was to elevate small scale as a solution that cities and communities should be thinking about in conjunction with some areas. I mean, you couldn't do Hudson Yards on a small scale basis, but there are a lot of places, especially in a lot of the suburban corridors where a small scale development might actually work pretty well. And this is a good example. So this is San Francisco. You may be familiar when the 1989 earthquake came. The viaduct that left the 101 dropped down into the neighborhood. So, because we can never do anything easily in San Francisco, there were 3 referendums. They finally approved they weren't going to build it and rebuild it. And so they built what became Octavia Boulevard, which is a really lovely kind of carriage street, comes off the freeway, comes into the neighborhood. The neighborhood was heavily disinvested and kind of drug infested because it had this huge, freeway coming into it. And so all of the red parcels you see there are Caltrans parcels that were left over when the freeway came down. And so a lot of cities would have looked at that and said, oh, we need a master developer to come in and buy all of this and figure out what to do with it and plan it. And San Francisco, to their credit, said, no, we're going to put an RFP out for every one of those sites, and we're going to see what we get so it's more granular, more interesting. And so they did that. One of the guys that won one of the sites was a developer out of Oakland, or an architect out of Oakland, Doug Burnham, Envelope A&D. And he did a little bit, before Starland Yard, he did the tactical urbanism thing. Movie screen, painted the pavement with some markings that become part of a boot camp for fitness, and then shipping containers. And his thesis here was for small entrepreneurial businesses to buy the shipping container, lease the site from him. And so this was the first place, the woman that invented the ice cream that they make with liquid nitrogen, you pick your flavors and all that, that's where she started. Bike shop, coffee shop, all that kind of stuff. And then he did the other thing that everybody loves, beer and pretzels and some Tivoli lights. But this became the really cool, hip neighborhood. What had been the most disinvested, kind of drug-invested neighborhood now became the cool, hip place to be. So Aether comes along, which is a high-performance sportswear. They don't have a flagship. They're all online, and they say, this is where we want our flagship. So they hire Doug, and he does this 3-stack shipping container, which is their flagship store, and it anchors that site that he did. Series of other developments come in, start to fill in, and then Avalon Bay, which is one of the really big apartment REITs, come in, and they buy the 1 2-acre parcel that's available in this whole neighborhood. But they don't just come and do their same old formula thing. They actually hire 4 architects to do 4 buildings on a single podium with a single connected parking space underneath. So you get this granularity and materiality that's very different across that building that kind of fits into the neighborhood. And when I talked to the developers, like, so what was that process like? You had like 4 architects working on the same building. It's like, oh my God, that was like really, really painful. But I learned a lot, and it was actually really good. And they actually went on and did it in another neighborhood because the neighborhood responded to it very well because of the attention to not being homogeneous. It really was 4 different approaches to the design. All right, I'm going to end with, this is the last project, the one that kind of was on the title slide. This was one that I was working on during COVID. And I've been using the shorthand a lot because there's a lot of great conversation going on in the country now about all of the rezoning, get rid of single family zoning, increase the zoning, 4 units per lot, which is really great. But as a developer and a person who's kind of been in the trenches, I think that's important, but more important is creating a thought partner approach between cities and developers, not just changing the codes. And so this project, which I think was a very creative outcome, without any changes to our policy, this was without any changes to zoning, but it was because the city sat down with me, got the vision early on, and we worked through a very archaic code by finding hacks and nooks and crannies and ways that they could justify things because they wanted to see it, even though it wasn't the letter of the code, it was actually part of it. So it's called River House. And I mentioned today about small developers being hyper-local. I live here. These are my projects. They're all within 1,000 feet of each other. I had a rule where I wouldn't do anything I couldn't ride my bike to. Actually, that's it up in the right-hand corner, so that's where River House was. So I kind of broke my rule, but it was a pretty cool site. So this is a story. So I got hired in 2015 because we have an affordable housing problem. I'm not sure you can relate to that at all, but largely very much self-inflicted because we have a growth management ordinance. So I was hired to spend a year teaching housing policies and economics and how it really works in the world. And part of that process was to take the community through a series of exercises showing different product types that were out there. And then that ended with this, which was, what would you like to see more of in the community? And very simple, back in the day when you gave everybody a clicker, now you can do this on your phones, but we all voted, and it's pretty simple that what everybody said they loved the most, and of course the image is always so good for the cottage court product. A lot of interest here, but the other thing that's interesting here is how many people said, we don't need any more single family homes. And I've done this like in 3 other communities, and it's always the same answer. So while some of the loudest voices are like, we don't want that density, we don't want those townhomes, there's actually not a lot of people that are saying we need more single family homes. So that provided me as an opportunity as a developer to actually be the hero. And one of the things I tell students a lot is, if your project is the vehicle by which a community has a conversation about what they want to be, you're dead. It will never get built. But if you can come in after the city has actually had a conversation about their future, and then you can be the one to say, hey, I heard you say you want to do this, I'm here to help deliver that, then you can be the hero. And so in this case, we spent a year, there was that big bar that said we want cottage courts. This site became available, and I said, well, I'm going to buy this, I'd like to do a cottage court. And so sat down with the city and presented 3 scenarios, pretty standard stuff, but there was like an as-of-right scenario, 7 units, a middle ground scenario, we're pushing the envelope, 11 units, and then a really aggressive scenario with like 24 units or something. And each of them had implications in terms of approvals and affordability and CEQA and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, really enlisted the city staff and say, what could you support? And like, as of right would be a shame to waste that site, but the other one's a bridge too far. Can we kind of find some middle ground? So we agreed on that middle ground of about 11 to 12 units, and then did it. And then we went to, so kind of agreed on the program, and then went to the community and did a really kind of dumb, simple thing, but incredibly effective. And this was it. So showed this image and said, okay, did the plan and said, okay, this is what the code says we can build. This is what the code says we should build. We'd really like to build this. So, do you want this? Or do you want that? And I'm like, oh, no, we want that, we want that. And it's like, okay, well, then you got to think differently about the way you come to these meetings and think about what the code says, because we're never going to get that if you just kind of take everything for the letter. So that really opened the dialogue about what we were going to build and how we all have to think different and be willing to experiment. So this is the outcome. It's 12 units on 1.2 acres. Very much a you know, front porch living, cars are subordinated in the back. It is a fee simple project, so every one of those are lotted, and I'll talk a little bit about it. Let me see here. A couple of the big moves, you know, you got the central green space, so the idea is you have a shared community space, but there is private spaces for very much about the layering. I think that's the landscape architect in me, about these, the public, the semi-public, the semi-private, and the very much private spaces. Really, one of the beautiful things about this site was, I'm going to skip here, were the trees. We had 14 heritage trees, so as won a couple national awards for this, one of the jurors said the trees allowed you to cheat history. And it really, you know, it just shows. It looks like those have always been there and settled in there. A quick aside, we had 14 trees, we had to take one down, so I brought a portable mill on the site, and we milled it, and so that became the community table, these little blocks here, and then a bar on each of the front porches, and we call that our homage to Tree 31. But you can see the plan, you know, fairly simple diagram where we were working around the existing trees. We were trying to circle things around the green space, and in marketing this, I would often say to people, you sit on your front porch and you look at the green, not your neighbor's driveway. So it's this idea of the shared community space. The cars are in the back here, the garage is in the back here. And one of the interesting conversations we had a lot was, you know, we could have very easily put the garages here and the lane here. So you come out of your garage and you go right into your house. But we said, no, we're going to put the garages here, so you got to get out of your garage, you got to walk across the lane, and then you go into your house, and there's a good chance you'll run into one of your neighbors. And when we tell that story to people that are buying, they're like, oh yeah, absolutely, that was the right decision. So I think there is, and we'll talk about the, you know, self-selecting audiences. This is the Cottage Walk. Variety of housing types where everybody had, even though this is a 500 square foot ADU, it was very much about the fabric of that community, and it has a dialogue with the bigger house across the street in terms of that kind of dignity and identity relationship. One of the most important things about this, that again, I talked to students and other industry groups, was we did the urban form of this first. And when you're dealing at this level of density, I know there's a number of architects in the room that understand this. This is about the inches and the spaces and the nooks and crannies, not just about the product. And so the typical thing that a developer would do is they'd hire their civil engineer and they would lay out the lots to the code, and then they'd figure out what sold best and they'd drop it into this. In this case, we did a three-dimensional model, saving the trees, the special places, the terminated vistas, the things we wanted to do. And then we came in and we lotted it. So we came out and we had to meet this is where we had to meet the standards, 50 by 90 minimum feet, 6,000 square feet, 35% lot coverage, literally sitting with the engineer and moving the lot line in 3-inch increments until we hit 34.9% coverage. So a lot of Swiss watchmaking to get this thing done because the codes weren't supportive of it, but we were able to hack our way through it without having to go through the process of changing the code. The funny story about this is this one right here, which you can see, and I call that the money lot. So in small scale development, you don't make any money until you sell the last unit, because that's where all of the profit is. And this was the lot that actually made the project work financially. With 7 units, it was kind of a break even. With this one, it actually made money. So it was really important financially. It was also important urbanistically because it created the wall, that second wall for the outdoor living room. Without that, you can imagine it would just been a kind of a fence and green space. So, but we go to, but how do you connect that to the garage? Because the garage has to be on the lot. So this is how we did it. And I tell this story because I think most jurisdictions anywhere in the country, they would look at that and say, well, that's not a lot. That doesn't meet the standard. That's only 4 feet. This is the lot right here. The sidewalk was, we surveyed that in and then poured the sidewalk on that lot and with an easement. So it was a way that we solved the 3-dimensional problem by working around the difficulties of the existing code. The funny story and the other piece of this is I went to the planning commission, and there's always one planning commissioner, those of you that have been through these things, and she says, and looks at that and says, who's going to carry their groceries in the garage in the rain? I would never carry my groceries in the rain to that. You've got to put the garage next to the house. I'm like, well, no, I'm the developer. I'm taking the risk, and you're not my market. And she said, no, I would never approve this. So we had this long, back and forth, and what I call me search. What do I want, not what's this research. So So anyway, so finally the other commissioners prevailed, one or, at least overruled her, and we were able to build what we built. And the epilogue is that's the lot that sold for the most. So regardless of the fact that people have to carry their groceries in the rain, it was the one that was the most valuable because people saw the value of being on the green, having that central place. So again, not the same thing for everybody. Parking is always a big issue in any of these tighter projects. So again, we made an early decision that we were going to subordinate the cars, tuck them in the back. And again, because each garage is on its own lot, the code would have required a 3-foot setback on each side of the building. But we were able to argue, and the city totally got it, that by taking all of those little 3-foot slivers and combining them into 2 parking bays, we created guest parking, which was one of the big concerns of the neighborhood. So we made an adjustment for having that 3-foot side yard setback, actually made it more efficient for us as a developer. And I think architecturally, it actually made it a lot more interesting because you've got this long building perfectly placed and oriented for solar. So every house has a pretty good solar array on the top. And then the other one that's always a fun one to talk about is fire. So we got, and I actually did the thing where I sat down with the fire department early on and said, this is what we're thinking. They're like, yeah, no, that makes sense. We can do that. So we get all the way through permits and then go ready to pull the permit, and the fire department says, you can't do that. It's a 220-foot fire lane. You need a cul-de-sac. I'm like, well, if I do a cul-de-sac, you just lost like 4 units. Well, you need a hammerhead. No, you can't do that. So we're arguing back and forth. Well, it's 220 feet. Well, no. It's 150 feet that you back, and then you pull the hose 150 feet. That's code. And I'm like, no, it's 220-foot fire lane, 220-foot fire. So I said, well, what if it was a 150-foot fire lane and a 70-foot driveway? I'm like, oh yeah, no, that works. So sometimes you just, it's just about the semantics, and you just got to change some things, but understand it. So. Anyways, the last one is, there's a lot of discussion in California about housing affordability, and I get it. But my big pitch is I think we need to equally be talking about housing diversity, because not everybody wants to live in the same thing regardless. So one of the things that we did very intentionally in this, we've got 3 different product types, the house, the cottage, the studio, and intermix those as an architectural composition and a placemaking composition. So the ADUs were not just stuck in the backyard, they're actually brought out to the street to help animate the street and transition from the scale of the adjoining neighbors. They're brought out as a visual terminus coming down here. They're part of the fabric in that little cottage walk that you see, and then you get an idea. So these are not big houses, but very much about light and volume and kind of lifestyle, what's offered. And then one of the really fun things we did was we called the lantern on the green, which were these little screened porches that looked out over the green. And they ended up being screened because if I went over 1,250 square feet, it was a whole new fee structure. So we ended up treating them as unconditioned space, and they were a huge success because just having that screened porch is a level of privacy, but connectivity to outside. They do it in the South all the time, but we don't do it here. And I think if my daughter hadn't been in school in South Carolina, I never would have thought about it. But it's really great, and they're just magical because at night, they light up along the green, and people are out there eating and all that kind of stuff. And then the studios, which are only 500 square feet, but they're 1 bedroom, they are ADUs, but again, worked really well, and a huge premium. People really loved them. And for all the reasons that you would think, rental income, in-laws, boomerang kids, but the one that we heard a lot that I had not thought about was partners whose health was declining, and as they age, it would be a place that the caregivers could live and be part of the salary or income package. So anyways, I'll end with this slide and this quote, which I love, from Vito Provinsky, from Charleston Fancy, which I think speaks to the heart of why small-scale development really matters in terms of as a way of building places and the passion that people bring to it. If you love the book, or if you're interested more, I do have some books back here. Reminder, we're not quite in the holidays, but you're getting close. So if you got friends in school, or you want to send to the Civic Leaders, it's a great gift for that. I will sign tonight. And then this is an online social network. If you're interested, you can just go to that. It's free. We post a lot of the stuff that's going on. We have some on-demand conference or material from our conferences, and that's how you can get a hold of me. Okay.